It was one of those days that started like any other but ended up changing everything. She remembers waking up early, the kind of morning where the air feels heavy, like it's holding its breath. Rose had been working as a nanny for the family for over 20 years, and even though she wasn't related to them by blood, she considered them her own. Alexander, the boy she had raised since he was a toddler, was now a grown man. Successful, wealthy, but still the same kind-hearted kid she had always known. Or so she thought. That day, he was hosting a big party at the family estate, and Rose was helping out as usual, making sure everything was perfect. She didn't know it then, but that day would test everything she thought she knew about loyalty, family, and self-respect. The tension had been building for weeks ever since Alexander got engaged to Victoria, a woman who seemed to despise Rose from the moment they met. Victoria had this way of looking at her like she was nothing, like she didn't belong in the world Victoria was so desperate to be a part of. And that day, it all came to a head. Rose had spent the morning preparing the house, arranging flowers, and making sure the food was perfect. She didn't mind the work. It was her way of showing love. But as the guests started arriving, she noticed the way Victoria's eyes followed her, cold and calculating. It wasn't the first time Rose had felt uncomfortable around her, but this time, it felt different. There was a tension in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Rose tried to stay out of the way, focusing on her tasks, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And then, it did. During the dinner, Victoria made a point of humiliating Rose in front of everyone, spilling wine on her dress and making snide remarks about her age and place in the household. Rose stood there frozen, her cheeks burning with shame. But what hurt the most was Alexander's silence. He didn't say a word, didn't defend her, and that silence cut deeper than any of Victoria's cruel words. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Rose. She tried to keep her composure, but every time she caught a glimpse of Victoria's smug smile or Alexander's distant expression, it felt like a punch to the gut. She had always been there for him, through his scraped knees, his teenage heartbreaks, even the loss of his parents. She had been his constant, his safe place. But now, standing in that grand dining room surrounded by people who barely acknowledged her existence, she felt invisible. The worst part was that she couldn't even blame Victoria entirely. Yes, she was cruel and calculating, but it was Alexander's silence that stung the most. Rose had always believed that family wasn't about blood, but about the bonds you build over time. And yet in that moment she felt like nothing more than an employee, someone who could be discarded when it was convenient. She excused herself from the room, claiming she needed to check on something in the kitchen, but really, she just needed a moment to breathe. The kitchen was quiet, a stark contrast to the noise and laughter coming from the dining room. She leaned against the counter, her hands trembling, and tried to steady herself. She had faced challenges before. Life had never been easy, but this felt different. This wasn't just about her pride. It was about realizing that the person she had devoted her life to might not see her the same way she saw him. And that realization hurt more than anything Victoria could ever say or do. As she stood there, trying to gather her thoughts, she heard footsteps approaching. For a brief moment, she hoped it was Alexander, coming to apologize, to make things right. But when she turned around, it was Victoria, standing in the doorway with that same cold, mocking smile. "Still here?" Victoria said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I thought you'd have the sense to leave by now." Rose didn't respond. She just stood there, her heart pounding, wondering how things had gotten to this point. Victoria didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked away, leaving Rose alone once again, her mind racing and her heart heavy with disappointment. Rose didn't know how long she stood there in the kitchen, her mind replaying everything that had happened. The sound of the party in the other room felt distant, like it was happening in another world. She thought about leaving, just walking out and never looking back. But something inside her wouldn't let her give up. Not yet. She had spent too much of her life in this house, caring for this family, to let Victoria chase her away. She took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and decided to go back to the dining room. She wasn't going to let Victoria win. When she walked back in, the room was still buzzing with conversation, but she noticed a few people glancing at her. their expressions a mix of pity and curiosity. Rose ignored them and focused on her tasks, refilling drinks and clearing plates. She kept her head high, even though every fiber of her being wanted to disappear. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, Victoria struck again. This time it was more deliberate, more public. She accidentally spilled another glass of wine on Rose, this time in front of everyone. The room fell silent, all eyes on Rose as she stood there, her dress soaked and her face burning with humiliation. Victoria laughed, a cold, mocking sound that echoed in the sudden quiet. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, her tone anything but apologetic. "You really should be more careful." Rose felt the weight of everyone's stares, but what hurt the most was Alexander's silence. He was standing right there, watching it all happen, and yet he said nothing. It was in that moment that something inside Rose snapped. She wasn't going to let this continue. Not anymore. She looked at Alexander, her eyes filled with a mix of hurt and defiance, and said, "Is this really who you've become? Someone who stands by and lets people treat others like they're nothing?" The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Alexander's face went pale, and for the first time that night, he looked like he was truly seeing her. Not as the nanny, but as the woman who had been his family for over 20 years. The silence in the room was deafening. Rose's words hung in the air, heavy and unignorable. For a moment no one moved or spoke. Even Victoria seemed caught off guard, her smug expression faltering as she glanced at Alexander, waiting to see how he would react. Rose didn't break eye contact with him. She had spent years putting his needs before her own, always being the strong one, the one who held everything together. But now, she needed him to see her, to really see her, and to understand the pain his silence had caused. Alexander's face was a mix of emotions, shock, guilt, and something else she couldn't quite place. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was as if he was finally realizing the weight of what had happened, the damage his inaction had caused. Rose didn't wait for him to respond. She turned and walked out of the room, her heart pounding but her head held high. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let anyone treat her like she was invisible ever again. As she made her way down the hallway, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around, not at first. But then she heard Alexander's voice, quiet but firm. "Rose, wait." She stopped, her back still to him, and took a deep breath. She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear what he had to say, but she knew she couldn't keep running. She turned to face him, and what she saw in his eyes surprised her. There was regret, yes, but also something she hadn't seen in a long time. The boy she had raised, the one who had always known right from wrong. He took a step closer, his voice trembling as he said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Those words, simple as they were, felt like a weight being lifted off her chest. But Rose wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. She needed more than just words. She needed to see that he meant it. Alexander's apology hung in the air between them, fragile and uncertain. Rose could see the sincerity in his eyes, but she also knew that words alone weren't enough. She had spent too many years giving her all to this family to accept a half-hearted attempt at making things right. She crossed her arms, her expression firm but not unkind. "Sorry doesn't fix what happened in there," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion swirling inside her. "You stood by and let her humiliate me, Alexander. In front of everyone. Do you have any idea how that felt?" He looked down, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. "I know," he said quietly, "and I don't have an excuse. I was wrong. I was so caught up in trying to keep the peace that I forgot what really matters." Rose studied him for a moment, trying to gauge whether he truly understood the gravity of his actions. She had seen him make mistakes before. He was human after all, but this felt different. This wasn't just about a lapse in judgment. It was about who he was becoming as a person, and that scared her. "This isn't just about me," she said finally. "It's about the kind of man you want to be. Do you really want to be someone who stands by while others are treated like they don't matter?" Alexander didn't answer right away. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of shame and determination, and then he nodded. "No," he said firmly. "I don't." And with that, he turned and walked back toward the dining room, leaving Rose standing there, her heart racing as she wondered what he was about to do. She wanted to follow him, to see what would happen next, but she stayed where she was. This was his moment, not hers. She had said her piece, and now it was up to him to decide what kind of person he wanted to be. Rose didn't have to wait long to find out what Alexander was going to do. From where she stood in the hallway, she could hear the sudden shift in the tone of the party. The laughter and chatter died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. She couldn't see what was happening, but she could imagine it. Alexander standing in the middle of the room, his presence commanding attention, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. She heard him speak, his words clear and firm, though she couldn't make out exactly what he was saying. And then she heard Victoria's voice, sharp and defensive, followed by the sound of footsteps, quick, angry footsteps, coming toward the hallway. Rose stepped back, her heart pounding as Victoria stormed past her, her face flushed with rage. She didn't even glance at Rose. She just kept walking, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way toward the front door. Rose stood there frozen, trying to process what had just happened. She didn't have to wonder for long. A moment later, Alexander appeared in the hallway, his expression a mix of relief and resolve. He looked at Rose, and for the first time that night, she saw the man she had always known he could be. "She's gone," he said simply, "and she's not coming back." Rose didn't know what to say. She had spent so much of the night feeling hurt and betrayed that she wasn't sure how to process this sudden shift. But before she could respond, Alexander stepped closer, his voice softening. "I should have stood up for you sooner," he said. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry. You've always been more than a nanny to me, Rose. You're family, and I won't let anyone treat you like that ever again." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her eyes fill with tears. For the first time that night she felt seen, truly seen. And it was enough to break through the wall of hurt she had built around herself. Rose didn't trust herself to speak right away. The emotions she had been holding back all night were threatening to spill over, and she didn't want to break down in front of Alexander. Not now, not when he was finally showing her the respect she deserved. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a grand declaration or a dramatic moment, but it was enough. Alexander nodded back, his expression serious, but kind. "I mean it, Rose," he said. "You've always been there for me, and I should have been there for you. I won't make that mistake again." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for the first time that night, Rose felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things could change. Maybe he could change. The party was still going on in the other room, but neither of them seemed to care. For a moment, it was just the two of them, standing in the hallway, the weight of everything that had happened hanging in the air between them. And then, Alexander did something that surprised her. He reached out and hugged her. It wasn't a grand gesture or an over-the-top display of emotion. It was just a simple, heartfelt hug, the kind you give someone when words aren't enough. Rose hesitated for a moment, then hugged him back, her eyes closing as she let herself feel the comfort of that moment. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. As they pulled away, Rose wiped her eyes and managed a small smile. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice steady now. "It's not easy to stand up for what's right, especially when it means going against someone you care about." Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You've always been my moral compass, even when I didn't want to admit it." Rose didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. The night wasn't over, and there were still things to figure out, but for the first time in a long time she felt like things might actually be okay. The rest of the party passed in a blur. Rose stayed in the background, helping where she could, but the atmosphere had shifted. The guests seemed to sense something significant had happened, even if they didn't know the details. There were whispers and curious glances, but Rose didn't let it bother her. She had done what she needed to do, and so had Alexander. That was enough. As the night wound down, Rose found herself alone in the kitchen, cleaning up. It was a familiar routine, but tonight it felt different. She wasn't just going through the motions. She was reflecting on everything that had happened. She was still hurt. Alexander's silence earlier had cut deep, but she also felt relief. He had finally stood up for her, and that meant something. It meant the boy she had raised, the one who knew right from wrong, was still in there. As she wiped the counters, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Alexander in the doorway, looking tired but determined. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "I want to make things right, not just with words but with actions." Rose set down the dishcloth and looked at him, curious but guarded. "What do you mean?" she asked. Alexander took a deep breath. "I want to give you something," he said. "Something that shows how much you mean to me and this family." Rose shook her head. "You don't have to give me anything. I just need to know you see me, that you value me." He nodded. "I know. But this isn't just a gift. It's a promise." He handed her an envelope. Rose opened it, her eyes widening as she read the contents. It was the deed to a small house, a place of her own. She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "Alexander, I don't know what to say." He smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just know this is my way of showing how much you mean to me. You've always been family, Rose. And now, you'll always have a home." The next morning, Rose woke up early, as she always did. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a big event when everything feels still and reflective. She made her way to the kitchen, half expecting to find Alexander there, but the room was empty. She brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the table, the deed to the house sitting in front of her. She still couldn't quite believe it was real. As she sipped her coffee, she thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the confrontation, the apology, and finally, the gift. It had been a whirlwind of emotions, but now, in the calm of the morning, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had a place in it, a place that was truly hers. She was still lost in thought when Alexander walked in, looking as tired as she felt. "Morning," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "How are you feeling?" Rose smiled faintly. "Better," she said. "Thank you, for everything." He nodded, sitting down across from her. "I meant what I said last night," he said. "You're family, Rose, and I'm going to do better by you. I promise." Rose didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. The look in her eyes said it all. They sat there in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that comes when words aren't needed. And for the first time in a long time, Rose felt like things were going to be okay. She looked at Alexander, her expression soft but serious. "I know you will," she said, "and I'll be here to help you just like I always have." Alexander smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "I know," he said, "and I'm grateful for that, more than you'll ever know." Rose nodded, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were on the right path. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. Alexander made an effort to include Rose in family decisions, something he had never done before. He asked for her opinion, listened to her advice, and treated her with the respect she had always deserved. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still times when old habits crept in, but it was progress. And for Rose, that was enough. She started making plans for her new house, imagining what it would be like to have a place of her own. It was a strange feeling, but a good one. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had something that was truly hers. Alexander helped her with the paperwork and even offered to help her move. But Rose declined. "This is something I need to do on my own," she said, and he understood. The day she moved into her new house was bittersweet. She was excited to start this new chapter of her life, but she also felt a pang of sadness at leaving the place that had been her home for so long. As she stood in the doorway of her new house, keys in hand, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't felt in years. This was her place, her fresh start, and she was ready for it. She spent the first day unpacking, arranging her belongings in a way that felt uniquely hers. It was a small thing, but it made her feel in control in a way she hadn't in a long time. That evening, as she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The past few months had been hard, but they had also been transformative. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had found a new sense of self-worth. And for that, she was grateful. Rose's new life wasn't without its challenges, but it was hers, and that made all the difference. She still visited the family estate often, helping out where she could, but now it was on her terms. Alexander continued to show his gratitude in small but meaningful ways, checking in on her, inviting her to family gatherings, and always making sure she felt valued. Over time, their relationship grew stronger, built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. Rose's new house became a sanctuary, a place where she could finally breathe and be herself. She planted a garden, filled the rooms with things she loved, and even adopted a stray cat that showed up on her doorstep one day. It wasn't a grand or dramatic life, but it was hers, and that was enough. Looking back, Rose realized that the hardest moments had also been the most transformative. They had forced her to stand up for herself, to demand the respect she deserved, and to create a life that was truly her own. And for that, she was grateful. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sunset, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. She had found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she was meant to be. The past no longer weighed her down. Instead, it had become a part of her story, a reminder of how far she had come. She thought about Alexander, about the family she had helped raise, and about the new life she had built for herself. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Rose smiled. She had faced her challenges, stood her ground, and come out stronger on the other side. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace.